in Gaston County in North Carolina, or Robeson County in North Carolina, you've got to run the gauntlet of that Confederate monument, that monument to white supremacy,
Right.
staring you in the face.
Hello, everyone. This is Miles Desilo, back again from the Monumental Project on behalf of the Monuments Toolkit and World Heritage USA. We hope you had a great Black History Month filled with knowledge, awareness, and love. Today we are giving you the second part of our North Carolina episode, rounding off the conversation with the political and legal side of changemaking. Let's get started. As stated in the last episode, controversial monuments in North Carolina unfortunately go hand in hand. The first Confederate memorial in North Carolina, an unnamed Confederate Soldiers Monument in Fayetteville, was built in 1868, only a few years after the South lost the war. Since then, Confederate memorials have been prominently displayed in the Tar Heel State. Many of these monuments, as is the case with most monuments around the country, are legally protected by a few laws that have gotten in the way of reconciliation. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies to consider the potential adverse effects of their undertakings on historic structures before taking action, is the most likely provision to prevent the removal of a Confederate monument. Although perceived as a cut-and-dry roadblock towards progress, there are still plans of action to make things better for North Carolina citizens and American citizens who want to take these monuments down. To speak to this, we sat down with James Williams Jr. from the North Carolina Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System. James E. Williams Jr. received a BA in Political Science and a JD from Duke University. He was Chair Public Defender for Orange and Chatham counties from 1990 to 2017. In 2010, while a member of the North Carolina Advocates for Justice Board of Governors, Mr. Williams helped establish and served as chair of the Task Force on Racial and Ethnic Bias in the Criminal Justice System. In 2012, the work of the task force led to the establishment of the NC Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System, of which Mr. Williams served as board member and now commission chair. This organization, also known as NC CRED, is an incredible nonpartisan organization that works across professional, political, and ideological lines to develop strategies to reduce racial disparities in North Carolina's juvenile and criminal justice systems. The Monumental Project sat down with James Williams Jr. to speak on the legal landscape of Confederate monuments, recent cases that have caused controversy, and what we can do to make a change on a local level. Enjoy. Mr. Williams, how are you doing today?
I am doing well. I hope you are.
I'm doing well. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. It means a lot.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So to start, if you can just please give a brief introduction to yourself and the work that you do.
I am James E. Williams Jr. I am a lawyer by profession, even though I am currently retired, but I am still licensed here in the state of North Carolina. Prior to retiring, I was public defender for Orange and Chatham counties here in North Carolina for 27 years. I retired in 2017. So currently, my work, so to speak, is related to trying to move forward in terms of in a progressive way on issues of racial justice and equity writ large, with probably a primary focus on criminal justice issues. I chair a commission called the North Carolina Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System, or NC CRED, we call it for short. But in addition to that, I am a part of several local groups, and also I'm a board member of the National Consortium on Racial and Ethnic Fairness in the Courts, which has a mission sort of similar to that of NC CRED, even though it's a national organization.
Right. Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. That's great. So was law always the path you wanted to go down, and criminal justice reform at that, or was the route to get here a bit more windy and varied, so to speak?
I won't say it was always, because when I think back, my memory of what I might be is something that goes back to my childhood. And I know one of the earliest aspirations, if you can call it that, was to be a jet plane pilot. I'm from northeastern North Carolina, and there are military bases there, including Air Force bases. And we would, as young kids, those planes would fly overhead, and I just thought it would be a cool thing. But of course, sort of moving forward, as I got older, even before high school, my perspective was beginning to change. And in a nutshell, there were several factors that led me to consider law. One was an early encounter with Floyd McKissick, Sr., probably in the mid 1960s. And just hearing him speak, and the passion and the courage and the conviction with which he spoke, when I found out that he was a lawyer, said, this is something I would give some thought to. And then, actually in my sophomore year in college, I did a summer internship at Soul City, and so had further discussions, involvement with Floyd McKissick. And finally, I guess, by the time I'm in undergrad school, I'm aware, or better aware, and appreciate the potential impact of the law in transforming a justice society and accomplishing that goal of equal justice for all. So I think it was a combination of those things that pointed me in the direction of law school.
That makes sense. Yeah, interesting. So you started off, you said, as a jet pilot and transitioned into law. I think that's pretty cool.
Right.
You never know where someone's going to take you.
Along the way, there were people, including people within my community, within my church, teachers at school, this is like elementary school. Man, James, why don't you think about becoming a doctor? And so, for a moment, I thought about that. I didn't give that serious thought, especially once I got to college and took chemistry and realized that wasn't my strong suit, so to speak. And so I sort of tossed that one aside without, investing a lot of time and energy in it.
Right. Makes sense. Interesting. So you said you were, from North Carolina originally. What was your personal experience with Confederate monuments growing up? The topic at hand today, whether it was something you noticed early on or you didn't notice until later. How present were these kinds of monuments and symbols while you were growing up?
Well, so in terms of Confederate monuments per se, I don't recall a lot about the monuments piece. There was not a Confederate monument, so to speak, in my hometown of Plymouth. Wow. As a young person, we didn't, for a number of reasons, we didn't travel a lot. Part of it was economics, part of it was Jim Crow. So we were mostly, when we did go to visit, it was people within maybe the next county, or family members or cousins, that sort of thing.
Right.
And so I didn't have the occasion to actually see, to the extent you can call it an authentic Confederate monument until I got older. But I was certainly familiar with other Confederate iconography, like the Confederate flag, for instance. And when I think about Confederate monuments, I don't think about just those big figures, in front of courthouses or in public places. I think about those entities, believers in white supremacy, who have, valued the Confederacy and what it stands for, in addition to thinking about the Confederate monument. So the Confederate flag, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan, the burning of crosses, the white robes, all of those things were things that I was acquainted with even before I started high school.
That makes sense. Yeah, a lot of people that have been guests on the show have had similar experiences, like direct Confederate monuments. Those figures may not have been as present, but the idea of the Confederacy and the iconography around it is a bit more overt in society. And then I think the Confederate monuments kind of come together a little bit later as you kind of start to look up and realize that they're all over the place, you know? Yeah, interesting
Right.
stuff. So NC Cred is doing amazing stuff in the state when it comes to helping minorities fight against the justice system in a multitude of ways, right? One of the ways that you do this is by seeking common ground by engaging in thorough, vigorous, and respectful dialogue. Can you give me some examples of this ethos in action?
Well, I think, so some examples that come to mind. I mean, early on when we launched NC Cred, and there's a history to that too, but I may get to that later.
Mhm.
But in the early days of operation of NC Cred, one of the first major events that we did was a symposium on mass incarceration. At that time, mass incarceration was not a concept that was in, say, general use
Mm,
by stakeholders, even a number of advocates for reform were not familiar necessarily with the concept
right.
of mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow. So we wanted to do an event that would capture the scope and the magnitude of our, racialized criminal justice or criminal legal system,
Mhm.
and so that people who could help bring about change, people who were gatekeepers, so to speak, would be more informed and knowledgeable. And
Right.
so we did this symposium on mass incarceration, and it was well attended. We intentionally included in our invite um, judges, DAs, formerly incarcerated people, law enforcement, civil rights advocates and attorneys, because we felt that the likelihood of bringing about change would be increased if we could have at the table sort of trying to come to at least some areas of common of consensus and
Yeah.
agreement so that we can begin to tackle
Mm.
this huge problem.
Interesting. Interesting. Wow. It always starts from the bottom up, right? After a while,
Yeah,
the political
yeah.
gridlock gets in the way of things. Such an
Mm-hmm.
interesting concept. So, NC Cred is no stranger to the topic of Confederate monuments. Backing up to that for a bit, the organization has held numerous events on the topic, right, including justifying and legitimizing racism, the role of lawyers in Confederate iconography at NC courthouses. This was a couple of years back. From a legal perspective, what processes have to happen that most people might not know about? You know, things that could get in the way of removal, relocation, or even reinterpretation of these monuments. What other things have to happen or shouldn't happen in order to prevent some change being made on a local or even state level?
Well, without going into too much detail, North Carolina is one of those states that
Mm,
that rushed to pass a statute, a law, basically protecting Confederate iconography and statues in particular, even though it's not worded as such. The input, the impact, and it's clear that one of the main purposes was to make it difficult, if not impossible, for local communities uh, to have these monuments removed.
mm,
So let's say if we talk about most of those monuments in public spaces, especially if you're talking about those in courthouse spaces and in courtyards and things of that nature,
right.
usually it's the Board of County Commissioners, because the the courthouse building itself, and usually the land on which it is situated, is usually county owned property.
Mm,
So typically people who are seeking to have a Confederate monument removed that is in that space, they would go to the Board of County Commissioners and try to persuade them to have the monument removed. Well, this statute that's in place in North Carolina makes it difficult for governmental entities that quote own those monuments to remove them, and there certain limited circumstances under which it can be done, without violating that statute. Now, it's not clear what would be the end result. I mean, what would be the remedy if an entity were to violate it? And one of those exceptions is, sort of public safety exception. And quite honestly, in looking at a number of the monuments that have been removed over, let's say, the past 4 or 5 years, I think most local entities utilize that public safety exception.
Right.
There have been others that have removed them because the county was able to basically show that they were not, quote, the owners of the monument. And so they're not, so this governmental entity, and that's what the statute, it controls or prohibits as governmental entities. So if that county is able to say, we don't own it, it's the Daughters of the Confederacy that own it, and we told them to come get it, and they refused to come get it, and so we're going to take it down. There have been few that have been removed under those circumstances. So what we do, we as our Confederate Monument Working Group and the attorneys that work with us, we want to make sure that people understand that despite the fact that there is this statute and this law, and it is a problem, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to understate the barriers and the difficulty that it raises, but we also want people to know that in and of itself is not an impossible barrier to overcome.
So I guess that leads me right into my next question. So to get your opinion, how do you feel about the current state of monuments discourse in North Carolina? Given the sheer number of monuments across the state, how close are we to seeing more of them come down? If this is not an impossible task, are we at least inching towards some more progress?
Well, I think so. And it is very contentious in a number of places. And I think that's going to continue for various reasons. But our position is that the bodies that control these, what happens to these monuments, they can't shy away from their responsibility to have their community be inclusive and not harmful to members of that community who are actually harmed by these Confederate monuments. And so we start from that premise, and we know, we being the NC Cred, that there are groups, organizations on the ground in a number of communities in the state of North Carolina who are seeking to have those monuments removed. And what our purpose is to provide support in various ways to those communities and those advocates in those communities who are seeking to have the monuments removed. And that support can come in a variety of ways. For instance, we have facilitated communities, having billboards, put up to better inform the public. And when I say the public, I'm not just talking about people within those communities, but I'm talking about people who travel to or through those communities. One of the most recent ones that we've facilitated getting put up is one in Edenton, North Carolina. Edenton is a heavily visited town in eastern North Carolina. It's a very historic town. It's near the coast, and there's big prominent billboards for the whole world to see, saying basically, excuse me, for our Confederate monument, we're working on it, or words to that effect.
Oh, wow.
And it's gotten attention. It has gotten attention. We are seeking to help them address some possible legal challenges that might come up related to the monument. But then, and we're also providing support for people in Columbia, North Carolina, which is in Terrell County, which is a county or two over. And so we think that continuing to work with those grassroots organizations who are doing various things to put this into the lap of those who have the power to remove it is the way to go.
Right.
To the extent we can provide resources to help with that, then we will continue to do that. And, not going to happen right away, but eventually it will happen if we sort of keep our hands to the plow, so to speak. I believe that truth crushed to the earth, will rise. And what? These Confederate monuments, if they stand for nothing, they stand for truth crushed to the earth, because they are built upon a lie and a lost cause.
Definitely, man. Especially that last piece. It's all about what the truth stands for and what you see as the truth. I mean, so many people for a long time thought this was the case, but like you said, I think these are almost symbols that change is happening soon. So the work in Edenton is so interesting. I didn't know about those billboards.
Yeah,
that is
they've had a couple of visits from Leonida Inge is I forget her exact title. She does sort of the race beat for public radio here in North Carolina, UNC. She did a piece. She went down to Edenton, spent time with people there, and did a piece on for WUNC that I thought was well done. This was within the past 2 or 3 weeks, and then last week on, I think, Wednesday or Thursday, there was a recording crew from another public radio station out of somewhere in the Northeast that actually did I think it was close to an hour-long program that was recorded there live in Edenton on the Confederate Monument. So that group is very well organized. They are out there in front of that monument every Saturday. So they are, I won't say that they are providing a blueprint necessarily for how you can get these monuments removed, but they certainly, their strategies, their approaches, is one I think that a lot of communities can benefit from.
Definitely. I actually want to transition into something that is almost the opposite of what you've been talking about with these groups trying to make a difference. In addition to certain laws limiting progress, there have also been cases of Confederate and historical quote unquote groups being very outspoken against certain removals. I'm sure you're aware of the case with the Vance Monument in Asheville and the Supreme Court's recent stance in taking up the opposing lawsuit to try to stop the removal of that monument. If you know anything about it, what are your thoughts on this case? And how difficult is it to take down these monuments when they're met with this kind of resistance?
So a couple of things, and in Asheville, Buncombe County, in Forsyth County, Winston-Salem, that was a case that actually was argued and decided by the North Carolina Supreme Court related to Forsyth County and the city of Winston-Salem removing a Confederate monument that was located at the site of I guess what was formerly the historic courthouse, maybe there in Forsyth County.
Right.
Once the statue was removed, the Daughters of the Confederacy, or the Sons, or both of them, filed some sort of action to try to seek to have it have the county put it back up. So without going into all the legal details of the case, the North Carolina, the trial judge ruled that the plaintiffs, the Daughters or the Sons, didn't have what's called standing to bring the suit, and so they dismissed it with prejudice, meaning they could not refile. The Court of Appeals adopted that. Then the Daughters appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And basically what the North Carolina Supreme Court said was, well, yes, it's true that they haven't shown standing, but they should be allowed to show standing if they can. And so they sent it back to the trial court. And if the plaintiffs can show standing, then I guess the case can proceed. I don't know how much to really read into that decision because it's still more or less pending. It's not been resolved. I don't know that they clearly, took a position that would be of major support or interest to either side, up to this point.
Right.
That, and as far as Vance, rest assured that anytime there's an effort to, even in Edenton, for instance, we were just talking, the daughters or the sons of the Confederacy have filed a petition there to asking the court for an injunction to prevent the removal of the monument, to prevent the town from. So it's almost like a cookie cutter approach. If they get wind of it, they try to get something in place to prevent it. They've appealed to the administrative agency that sort of oversees monuments and whether they have historical value. They've tried every tool in the toolkit, so to speak, but it's not been necessarily successful. I mean, they, even in those instances where they are involved, monuments still have come down. And so I think there's a path forward. I don't know, some of these cases that you're referring to are relatively new. There have also been cases that have been filed by advocates seeking to remove Confederate monuments. Right now, there's a lawsuit that has been filed in Alamance County seeking the removal of that monument. There's one that's been filed in Gaston County seeking a removal of that monument. And then there's one filed in another county somewhere in western North Carolina. I can't remember which county it is. So we have that litigation piece also. That's at play. And, it's probably going to be a year or two or three before we get more clarity as to whether or not the lawsuit approach is a viable approach. My thinking on this, when I talk to various communities and groups, I say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. For instance, don't assume that, okay, let's get somebody to file a lawsuit, and that's going to be the way we get the monument down, because that hasn't proven up to this point to be a strategy that has worked. In other words, I can't point to a community that has gone the lawsuit approach to try to get a monument removed that I can say, yep, that's the way to go, because the court in this case said that monument should be removed. Wow. We don't have that yet. I mean, it may come down the road. So that's why I say be open to using different tools within your toolkit. If you don't have the tools, then build that toolkit to include those tools. And then, based upon the circumstances on the ground where you are, that's how you design your game plan to get the monument removed within your jurisdiction.
Wow. So it really is kind of a case-by-case basis, it seems like. Either like the daughters and the sons of the Confederacy, as well as people trying to get them taken down, don't really have a whole lot of continual progress when it comes to lawsuits. But it's more about, what can you do in your situation to make the situation work, from what you're telling me, right? Okay.
Yeah, part of it, so some of these things, like, for instance, what level of support do you have within your community? Do various church groups support you? Do business people support you? Are your civic organizations and groups in support? The composition of your board of county commissioners and your town councils, for instance, has a lot to play. I mean, there are some communities where, the Board of County Commissioners are almost unanimously in favor of keeping the monuments up. So in order to get the monuments down in those communities, it's not going to happen until you change the composition of those county commissioners, right? And
Right. Right.
so that might be where the main thrust of that effort should go.
Right.
So it just varies from place to place.
The legal and political battle against these monuments is an uphill battle, to say the least, right? So, on a positive note, what are some notable wins that you've seen as the chair of NC-Cred? You talked about Edenton, and I think that's a great win, showing publicity and letting people know about the situation in that town. Are there any other places or cases where you're like, wow, like, action and justice made a positive difference towards this discourse?
Right. And I don't want to say, I'm not suggesting that NC-Cred deserves the credit, but I will say this. I know that anyone who's seeking to remove a Confederate monument and they're looking for resources, even just going to our website, one of the things that I'm most proud of is when you go to our microsite on Confederate monuments, you can find basically any number, whether you're looking at videos, whether you're looking at for speeches, whether you're looking at resolutions, whether you're looking at articles, whether you're trying to get a sense of who are some historians or some lawyers that might be able to help us. You're looking for the history of the monument in your area. All of that stuff is on our website. So that is something I'm certainly really proud of. But when we look at places where monuments have been removed, Pitt County, and it comes to mind, and I'm looking at some places that not necessarily were considered necessarily progressive,
Right.
as compared with, say, a city like Durham or a city of Asheville. But then little towns like Winton, North Carolina, for instance, most recently Enfield, North Carolina, monument has come down. So there are places, there are probably, and I don't have the figure right off the top of my head, but probably somewhere around 12 to 15 that have come down within the past, 3 to 4 years. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, interesting. All right, that's great. And was it Enfield where the mayor took it down himself?
Yes. Now the town council voted to have it removed, so he didn't just one day wake up and say, "I'm going to take this monument down."
Right.
The
Right.
town
Right.
council voted to have it removed. There was a resource issue and concern there, so he was able to go out and do it with equipment that he had, and that's what he did. And of course, there's a whole lot of backlash to that. And that's a story for another day. But yes,
Yeah.
Enfield
Definitely.
is where that took place, and that is a good segue and I don't know whether it may have been one of your questions, but what is coming up for NC-Cred? What
Yeah.
types of programs, things of that nature.
Beat me to it.
Uh, I I am really excited. April 13th, we are going to be hosting a symposium on harms caused by Confederate monuments. I don't think there's been a symposium quite like it before, not that I'm aware of anyway. And so we're going to be in Raleigh at Shaw University, the first historically Black university in the South. And it's going to be from like 10 until 4 o'clock. We've got have a opening keynote speaker is scheduled to be Bree Newsom, who's
Took
just a
down the
very
monument.
talented person in a lot of respects, but
Right.
she's best known for climbing that and taking that flag down in South Carolina. And I think
Right.
the
Right.
world knows about that. But we've got several panels that will be discussing this topic from various perspectives. We're going to have a historian. We're going to have psychological experts. We're going to have people involved in these efforts from their local communities. It's going to be a very rich conversation. And Mayor Mondale Robinson is going to be one of the panelists. He's the mayor of Enfield,
Right.
for our program, as is the Black contractor who took the monuments down in the Capitol building there in Raleigh. His experience was has been quite similar to the people have been reading about the contractor and who took the ones down in Richmond, the Black contractor. Well, there's one right here in North Carolina who kind of had similar experience taking monuments down here in North Carolina. Wow. So it's going to be, I think, an amazing program. We putting the finishing touches on it before we get our publicity out, but put that on your calendar.
Definitely for everybody who's listening. April 13th, correct?
Yes, April 13th.
Perfect. Wow. Well, thank you so much for this conversation that we've had. I've learned so much, and I'm sure everyone who's listening has learned just as much. This has been a great perspective that a lot of people don't really hear about, the legal and the political side of things that have to happen, should happen, kind of a different side of this monument conversation that I think more people need to know about. So this is the final question that we have. It's a question that we ask all of our guests. It's a loaded one, but please ask it or answer it as heavily or as lightly as possible. How do we correctly address these monuments of oppression?
Well, I think the best way to move forward is you have to engage in the conversation, first of all. But in terms of, I think the only good solution is to remove those Confederate monuments that are in public spaces. And when I say public spaces, I'm talking about public parks, I'm talking about courtyard squares, I'm talking about within the, downtown areas, for instance.
Right.
And to the extent they have, any value to anybody, put them either in a museum or some other location that people only view if they choose to actually view them. Right now, if you go to court in Gaston County in North Carolina, or Robeson County in North Carolina, you've got to run the gauntlet of that Confederate monument, that monument to white supremacy, staring you in the face. That should not be the case, certainly whether you Black, white, or whatever, but particularly to Black folk who know the history and who know what that monument stands for. When I say Black people, I don't care if you work there as a clerk of court or whatever, or whether you are on the janitorial staff, or whether you are a juror, or whether you are a defendant, or whether you are a lawyer, whatever the case may be. That message that is being sent out loud and clear is, if you Black, you ain't getting no justice here. That should not be. So they have to be removed. And I know it's not necessarily a simple process, but we have to take the necessary steps and get people to understand, if this, in this case, these communities, if it values, inclusion, if it values equality and justice and fairness to all, then it would not have those monuments standing in the first place. And so let's take them down.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. We'd like to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the entire World Heritage USA team, and all of our listeners around the world for tuning in. Tune in next month as we talk to another leader in the historic conservation space. You won't want to miss it. And if you're in the North Carolina area, make sure to check out the Harms Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina on April 13th. It's set to be a really fascinating conversation on behalf of NC Cred. As always, I'm Miles Zezilo. Thank you.